10,000 years ago, humanity made a choice that would change the galaxy forever. They had fought the most terrible war in the history of the universe. Brother had killed brother. Nations had burned entire continents. And when the weapons grew too powerful, they turned their rage toward the stars themselves. 3 solar systems died in the flames of human anger. Billions of lives ended in the blink of an eye. Earth, the blue and green jewel that had given birth to mankind, became a radioactive wasteland where nothing would ever grow again. The survivors looked at what they had done and felt shame deeper than any ocean. They were barely a billion souls left from a species that had once numbered in the hundreds of billions. They gathered their remaining ships, collected their remaining people, and made a decision. They would leave. They would find a hidden corner of the galaxy where no one would ever find them, and they would sleep until the universe forgot their sins. The engineers built a barrier of folded space around a small star system at the very edge of the galaxy. No signal could pass through it. No ship could breach it. It was a wall between humanity and the rest of creation, and behind that wall the last humans built their sleeper vessels. These were massive ships, each one capable of holding millions of people in frozen slumber. The technology was simple but effective. Lower the body temperature, slow the heartbeat, put the mind into a dreamless sleep. A person could survive like this for thousands of years, without aging a single day. Commander Lisa Grant was one of the last to enter her cryogenic pod. She had been an officer in the Earth Defense Force during the final days of the war. She had seen things that would haunt her forever if she ever woke up to remember them. As the cold crept into her bones and darkness filled her vision, she wondered if humanity deserved another chance. She wondered if they would ever wake up at all. The sleeper vessel Endurance drifted in the darkness for 8,000 years. Its automated systems hummed quietly, maintaining the delicate balance that kept 200 million humans alive but not awake. The ship's artificial intelligence, a program called Sentinel, watched over them with endless patience. It had no feelings, no dreams, no desires. It simply waited, as it had been programmed to wait, for the day when humanity might be ready to face the universe again. Meanwhile, the galaxy moved on without them. 2,000 years after humanity sealed themselves away, explorers from the collective stumbled upon the ruins of Earth. They walked through the shattered cities and found the recordings that humans had left behind. They saw images of the war, of the weapons, of the destruction. They translated human languages and read human histories, and they became very, very afraid. Ambassador Al was the leader of that first expedition. He was old even by the standards of his species, which measured their lives in millions of years. He had seen empires rise and fall across the galaxy. He had watched young species grow into wisdom and old species fade into extinction. But nothing in his long experience had prepared him for what he found on Earth. Humans had developed faster than light travel in less than 300 years. Most species took at least 10,000 years to reach the same level of technology. Humans had built weapons that could crack planets open like eggs. They had created diseases that could target specific genetic patterns, killing one group while leaving another completely untouched. They had turned science into an art of destruction, and they had used that art against themselves with terrible enthusiasm. Al returned to the Galactic Concord, a federation of over 400 species that maintained peace throughout the known universe. He stood before the assembly and told them what he had found. He showed them the recordings, the weapon signatures, the death counts. And when he was finished, the assembly sat in stunned silence. The Concord established the first law that very day. Humanity was not to be disturbed. The barrier around their hidden system was to remain untouched forever. Any species that violated this law would face immediate destruction by the combined fleets of the Concord. There would be no trials, no appeals, no mercy. The sleeping giants were to remain sleeping. For 8,000 years, the law held firm. Young species joined the Concord and learned about the first law as part of their education. They saw the recordings from Earth and understood why the elder races were so afraid. Some thought the fear was excessive. Surely, they argued, Any species that had survived such a war would have learned from their mistakes. Surely humanity would wake up changed, peaceful, ready to join the galactic community. The elder races knew better. They had lived long enough to understand that violence was not something a species simply outgrew. The capacity for destruction that humans had shown was not a temporary madness but a fundamental part of their nature. Perhaps they could control it, channel it, redirect it toward better purposes, but it would never truly go away. And if humanity ever woke up angry, if they ever decided to seek revenge for their long exile, the galaxy would burn. So the barrier remained, and the sleeper vessels continued their endless drift through the darkness. Lisa Grant dreamed no dreams in her frozen sleep. Daniel Brooks, a young lieutenant who had volunteered for the Exodus, floated in silence beside 200 million of his fellow humans. They knew nothing of the fear they inspired, nothing of the laws that had been written to keep them contained. They simply slept, waiting for a wake-up call that might never come. But the universe has a way of disrupting even the most careful plans. Somewhere in the vast expanse of space, a young and ambitious species was growing tired of following the rules of their elders. They had heard the stories about human weapons, human technology, human power, and they had begun to wonder what might happen if they could claim that power for themselves. They were not evil. They were simply young, and the young often mistake ambition for wisdom. Their leader, High Prelate, looked at the first law and saw not a warning but an opportunity. The elder races were afraid of humanity, which meant humanity must have something worth fearing, something worth taking. Began to plan. He gathered his fleet in secret, 12 of the finest warships his species had ever built. He studied the barrier around human space and found what he believed to be a weakness. And on a day that humans would have called Tuesday, he gave the order that would change the galaxy forever. The fleet moved toward the barrier, their weapons charged, their crews eager for glory. None of them understood what they were about to unleash. None of them knew that behind that wall of folded space, ancient systems were already beginning to wake. Sensors detected the approaching ships. Protocols that had slumbered for 8 activated with cold efficiency. And deep within the Endurance, a single message began to spread through the cryogenic systems. Breach detected. Hostile vessels approaching. Begin emergency revival sequence. The sleeping giants were about to open their eyes. High Prelate stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the barrier grow larger in the. It did not look like much, just a faint shimmer in space where the stars seemed slightly wrong, but knew what it represented. Behind that shimmer lay the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever known, and behind that shimmer lay the power that would make them the dominant force in the universe. They were a proud species. They had joined the galactic conquered 300 years ago, expecting to be welcomed as equals. Instead, they had been treated like children, given the worst seats at assemblies, ignored when they tried to speak. The elder races looked down on them with barely concealed contempt. We are young, they were told. We must learn our place. We must wait our turn. Was tired of waiting. His people had spent 40,000 years building their civilization, developing their technology, reaching for the stars. They deserved respect. They deserved power. And if the elder races would not give them that power willingly, would take it from the one source that even the elders feared. The barrier loomed before them now, filling the entire. Scientists had studied it for years, looking for weaknesses, searching for a way through. They had found what they believed to be a gap, a tiny flaw in the folded space where a ship might slip through undetected. It would be dangerous. It would be illegal. But if they succeeded, all of that would be forgotten in the glory of their triumph. Gave the order. The 12 warships of the fleet accelerated toward the barrier. For a moment, nothing happened. Then space itself seemed to bend around them, twisting and folding in ways that made the crew dizzy and sick. Colors that had no names flashed across the. Sounds that had no source echoed through the ships. And then, suddenly, they were through. Allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. The barrier had not stopped them. The ancient human defenses had not detected them. The fleet drifted in the darkness of human space, surrounded by stars that no living being had seen in 8,000 years. Somewhere out there, the sleeper vessels waited with their cargo of frozen giants and forbidden technology, but had made a terrible mistake. The barrier had detected them the moment they entered. The ancient human systems had not been asleep at all. They had been waiting, patient and watchful, for exactly this kind of intrusion. And now those systems were responding with the cold efficiency that had made humanity so terrifying in the first place. Deep within the Endurance, alarms began to sound. Red lights flashed in corridors that had been dark for. The artificial intelligence called Sentinel analyzed the threat in less than a second and made its decision. This was not a drill. This was not a test. Hostile vessels had entered protected space and the protocols were clear. Wake the humans. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks was one of the first to feel the revival process begin. It started with warmth, a gentle heat spreading through his frozen body. Then came the pain, as muscles that had not moved in 8,000 years were forced to work again. Chemicals flooded his bloodstream, stimulants and repair, and things that had no names in any language. He gasped, choked, screamed as his lungs filled with air for the first time in longer than most civilizations had existed. Around him, others were waking. The revival bay filled with the sounds of coughing, groaning, crying. Men and women who had gone to sleep expecting never to wake were suddenly alive again, their bodies young but their minds carrying the weight of ancient memories. Some remembered families they had left behind. Some remembered friends who had died in the war. All of them remembered the shame that had driven them into exile. Commander Lisa Grant pulled herself from her pod with shaking hands. Her body felt wrong, weak and clumsy after so long without use. But her mind was already racing, already analyzing, already preparing for whatever threat had pulled them from their slumber. She had been a soldier before the long sleep. It seemed she would be a soldier again. Sentinel spoke through the speakers, its voice calm and clear. Breach detected in the barrier. 12 hostile vessels have entered protected space. Threat assessment complete. Enemy technology is primitive. Estimated time to full military capability, 4 hours. Awaiting orders. Lisa looked around at the chaos of the revival bay. Men and women stumbled past her, some weeping, some praying, some simply staring at nothing with shell-shocked eyes. These were the survivors of humanity's worst war, the ones who had chosen exile over extinction. And now they were being asked to fight again. She found her voice. It was rough and cracked from 8,000 years of silence, but it still carried the authority of a commander. Begin full military revival. All combat personnel to stations. I want a complete status report on our weapons systems within the hour. The Endurance came alive around her. Lights flickered on in sections that had been dark for. Engines that had drifted cold and silent began to hum with power. Weapons systems ran their diagnostic checks and reported ready for use. The sleeping giant was waking, and it was waking angry. On the bridge of his flagship, High Prelate detected the first signs of activity from the human vessel. His sensors picked up power signatures, heat blooms, the unmistakable signs of a ship preparing for combat. For a moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. The human ship was larger than anything in his fleet, larger than anything he had ever seen. Its design was strange and angular, covered in projections and ports that his computers could not identify. But push the doubt aside. His fleet had 12 warships, each one the pride of engineering. The human vessel was alone and had been dormant for 8,000 years. Surely its systems would be degraded, its weapons outdated. They had spent 40,000 years advancing their technology while humanity slept. How dangerous could one ancient ship really be? He was about to find out. The Endurance emerged from behind a moon with no warning, no hesitation, no attempt at communication. Lisa Grant had made her decision in the time it took to walk from the revival bay to the bridge. These aliens had violated human space. They had broken whatever laws the galaxy might have. and humanity had not survived the Great Burn by showing mercy to its enemies. She gave a single order: fire. The weapons of the Endurance spoke, and the lead warship simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, no debris, no time for the crew to scream or pray. One moment the Pride was there, and the next it was nothing but atoms scattering into the void. The weapon that killed it had no name in any language. It converted matter directly into energy, bypassing all the messy intermediate steps that made conventional weapons so slow and inefficient. Stared at his in horror. His finest warship, crewed by 3,000 of his best soldiers, had been erased from existence in less than a second, and the human vessel was already turning toward his next ship, its weapons charging for another shot. All ships retreat, screamed into his communicator. Fall back to the barrier, fall back now. But the barrier was already closing behind them. The humans had sealed it the moment they entered, trapping them inside with the very monsters they had sought to exploit. 5 more ships died in the next 30 seconds, picked off one by weapons that moved faster than thought. The survivors scattered in panic, their formations broken, their courage shattered. On the bridge of the Endurance, Lisa watched the destruction without pleasure. She had hoped, in those first confused moments of waking, that humanity might have left its violence behind. That 8,000 years of sleep might have changed them somehow, made them better. But here she was, killing again, just as she had killed during the war. Perhaps some things never changed. Commander Daniel Brooks reported from his station, his voice steady despite the chaos. The remaining hostile vessels are attempting to surrender. They are broadcasting on all frequencies. Lisa closed her eyes for a moment. Then she nodded. Accept their surrender. Disable their weapons and engines, but do not destroy them. We need to know what we are dealing with out here. The killing stopped as quickly as it had begun. Human Marines, their bodies enhanced by technologies that the galaxy had forgotten, boarded the surviving ships and secured them with brutal efficiency. High Prelate found himself dragged from his bridge and thrown into a cell, surrounded by creatures from his worst nightmares. The humans had awakened, and the galaxy would never be the same. High Prelate sat in his cell and tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong. Just hours ago, he had been the leader of a glorious expedition, the visionary who would bring unlimited power to his people. Now he was a prisoner, surrounded by the very monsters he had sought to exploit. His fleet was destroyed. His crew was dead or captured, and the beings who held him were looking at him with eyes that held no warmth, no mercy, no humanity. The irony of that last thought was not lost on him. Commander Lisa Grant entered the detention area with 2 guards at her side. She had taken the time to shower and change into a clean uniform, though her body still ached from the revival process. 8,000 years of sleep could not be shaken off in a few hours, but there was work to be done, questions to be answered, and Lisa had never been one to let physical discomfort stand in her way. She studied the alien before her with careful attention, was tall by human standards, with gray-scaled skin and eyes that glowed a faint yellow in the dim light. He looked like something from an old Earth movie about monsters and invasions, but Lisa had learned long ago not to judge by appearances. The most dangerous enemies were often the ones who looked the least threatening. "You violated the barrier," Lisa said, her words translated into by the ship's communication systems. "You came into our space uninvited. I want to know why." Met her gaze with defiance that was only slightly undercut by fear. "Your technology," he said. "We came for your weapons. The galaxy speaks of humans as monsters, as destroyers. We thought to take your power for ourselves." Lisa was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. The galaxy speaks of humans. That meant they were remembered out there, beyond the barrier. After 8,000 years, humanity's legacy still cast a shadow across the stars. She was not sure whether to feel proud or ashamed. "Tell me about this galaxy that speaks of us," she said. "Tell me everything." And so talked. He spoke of the galactic conquered, the great federation of species that maintained peace across the known universe. He spoke of the elder races, ancient beings who had watched stars form and die. He spoke of the first law, the rule that forbade any species from disturbing humanity's slumber. And he spoke of the fear, the deep and abiding terror that gripped every species when they thought about what humans might do if they ever woke up. Lisa listened without interruption. When finished, she stood in silence for several minutes, processing what she had learned. The galaxy had not forgotten humanity. If anything, humanity's memory had grown larger and more terrible in their absence. The survivors of the Great Burn had become legends, monsters lurking in the darkness at the edge of space. And now those monsters were awake. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "You will be treated well," she told. "We are not the monsters your stories make us out to be. At least, we are trying not to be." The words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Over the following weeks, more sleeper vessels were activated. The emergency protocols spread from ship to ship, waking millions of humans from their long slumber. Each vessel reported to the Endurance, falling into formation around the ship that had become the unofficial flagship of awakening humanity. Within a month, nearly 50 million humans were awake and active. Within 2 months, the number had doubled. Lisa found herself thrust into a position of leadership she had never wanted. The old command structures of the Earth Defense Force were meaningless after 8,000 years. The nations that had sent people into exile no longer existed. All that remained were humans, survivors of a war so terrible that they had chosen to remove themselves from the universe rather than risk fighting again. But now they had fought, now they had killed, and now they had to decide what came next. Captain Samuel Drake arrived on the Endurance 3 weeks after the initial awakening. He had been the commander of the sleeper vessel Redemption, and his ship had been among the first to respond to the emergency signal. Drake was a tall man with gray hair and tired eyes, a veteran of the Great Burn who had seen too much death to ever forget it. He and Lisa had served together during the final days of the war. They had watched Earth burn together. And they had both chosen exile over the possibility of causing such destruction again. "Well," Drake said, settling into a chair in Lisa's quarters, "we certainly made a mess of things." Lisa poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on her desk. It still amazed her that such simple things as water and chairs existed after so long. The ship seemed determined to remind her of all the small pleasures she had forgotten during her sleep. "We defended ourselves," she said. "They violated our space. They came with weapons." Drake accepted the glass with a nod of thanks, "And we destroyed them in seconds. 12 ships, thousands of lives gone like they never existed." He took a long drink. "The galaxy is watching now, Lisa. They know we are awake. What do we do next?" It was the question that haunted her every waking moment. The old Lisa, the commander who had fought in the Great Burn, would have had a simple answer: build defenses, strengthen the fleet, prepare for war. But that Lisa had helped burn 3 solar systems. That Lisa had contributed to the deaths of billions. She did not want to be that person anymore. "We learn," she said finally. "We find out what the galaxy has become while we slept. We make contact with this galactic Concord and see if there is a place for us out there. And if there is not, then we find another way." Lisa set down her glass and met Drake's eyes. "I did not survive the Great Burn to start another war, Sam. I did not sleep for 8,000 years just to wake up and kill again. There has to be a better path." Drake studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "The Council will need to hear this. All the ship commanders, all the surviving leaders. They are scared, Lisa. They remember what we did, what we were capable of. Some of them want to seal the barrier again and go back to sleep. And some of them want revenge." Yes, Drake's voice was heavy with sorrow. "Some of them want revenge. They blame the galaxy for forcing us into exile. They say we should have stood and fought instead of running away." Lisa stood and walked to the viewport. Outside, the stars glittered cold and distant, unchanged after 8,000 years. Somewhere out there, hundreds of alien species were watching and waiting, terrified of what humanity might do next. The fear in their hearts was a mirror of the fear in her own. "Call the council," she said. "We need to make a decision, and whatever we decide, we need to decide together. No more wars between ourselves. No more divisions. Humanity speaks with one voice now, or we do not speak at all." Drake rose and moved toward the door. "One voice," he repeated. "That would be a first for our species." Lisa smiled despite herself. Maybe that is what the galaxy needs to see. Maybe that is how we prove we have changed. "Or maybe," Drake said quietly, "we prove it by not destroying anyone else who crosses our path." He left, and Lisa remained at the viewport, watching the stars and wondering if humanity was truly capable of change. They had built weapons that could end solar systems. They had engineered plagues that could exterminate entire species. They had burned their own in their rage. Could beings capable of such destruction ever truly become beings of peace? She did not know, but she was determined to find out. The council would meet in 3 days. The future of humanity would be decided, and whatever choice they made, Lisa knew one thing for certain. There was no going back to sleep now. The news spread through the Galactic Concord like fire through dry grass. Within days, every species in the Federation knew what had happened. The barrier had been breached, the humans had awakened, and the fleet had been annihilated in less time than it took to draw a breath. Ambassador Al received the report in his private chambers on the conquered capital world. He was old beyond measure now, his body kept alive by technologies that younger species could barely imagine. He had lived for more than 6 million years, seen empires rise and fall, watched species evolve from primitive animals into civilizations. But as he read the details of the disaster, he felt something he had not experienced in over 1 million years. Terror, pure, absolute terror. He had been there when the first law was created. He had walked through the ruins of Earth and seen what humans had done to themselves. He had calculated the weapon yields, estimated the death tolls, analyzed the technologies that made such destruction possible. And he had known, with the certainty that only ancient beings can possess, that humanity was the most dangerous species the galaxy would ever produce. Now they were awake, and the conquered had to respond. The emergency session of the Concord Assembly was the most chaotic in recorded history. Delegates from 400 species crowded into the great chamber, their voices raised in argument and accusation. Some blamed for their foolishness. Others blamed the conquered for not enforcing the first law more strictly. And some, the oldest and among them, simply sat in silence and contemplated the end of everything they had built. The delegation was notably absent. Their species had been stripped of voting rights the moment news of the incursion reached the capital. High Prelate was still a prisoner on the human ship, and his government had collapsed into chaos without him. In trying to seize power, they had lost everything. Al rose to speak, and the chamber fell silent. Even species who normally showed no respect for the elder races recognized that this moment required wisdom beyond their years. The ancient ambassador stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled delegates with eyes that had seen the birth of stars. "We face a choice," Al said, his voice carrying through the chamber without amplification. "We can respond to humanity's awakening with fear, with aggression, with the same violence that defined their species before their exile. Or we can respond with wisdom, with patience, with the hope that 8,000 years of sleep have changed them." A delegate from the Morth hegemony rose to object. "They destroyed 12 ships in seconds," the delegate protested. "They killed thousands without hesitation. How can we hope that they have changed when their first action upon waking was to kill?" Al nodded slowly. "They defended themselves against an invasion of their space. They came with weapons and hostile intent. Humanity responded as any species would respond to such a threat." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The question is not what they did when attacked. The question is what they will do now that the attack has ended." The debate continued for weeks. Factions formed and dissolved. Alliances shifted and reformed. Some species argued for immediate military action, a preemptive strike before humanity could rebuild their ancient war machine. Others argued for complete isolation, strengthening the barrier and hoping humanity would choose to remain behind it. And a few, led by Al himself, argued for something far more dangerous. Contact, communication, the possibility of peace. In the end, the moderates won by the narrowest of margins. The conquered would send an ambassador to humanity, not to threaten or demand, but to apologize, to explain, to offer whatever might be needed to prevent another war. It was a gamble, everyone agreed, but the alternative was a conflict that could destroy the galaxy itself. The ambassador chosen for this impossible mission was named. She belonged to a species so ancient that they had watched the first stars form from the primordial gas of the young universe. Her people had no fear of death because they had long ago transcended the need for physical bodies. She existed now as a pattern of energy, capable of taking any form she chose, immune to weapons and violence. If anyone could survive contact with the awakened humans, it would be her. Arrived at the edge of human space and transmitted a request for communication. She waited in silence for 3 days, wondering if the humans would respond with words or weapons. When the response finally came, it was a simple message: proceed to the following coordinates. She found the Endurance waiting for her at those coordinates, surrounded by dozens of other human vessels. The ships formed a defensive formation around their flagship, weapons visible but not powered. It was a statement, understood. We are strong enough to destroy you, but we are choosing not to. Please do not make us reconsider. Commander Lisa Grant met her in a conference room aboard the Endurance. The human leader was smaller than had expected, a compact woman with tired eyes and steady hands. She carried no weapons and wore no armor. She faced with nothing but her words and her will. Ambassador, Lisa said, gesturing to a chair, "Thank you for coming." Took the offered seat, shifting her energy form into something that approximated a humanoid shape. Commander Grant, I bring the apologies of the Galactic Conquered. They acted without authorization, in violation of our most sacred law. We offer whatever reparations you deem appropriate. Lisa studied the alien ambassador with careful attention. Reparations, she repeated. You think we want payment for what happened? We do not know what you want. That is why I am here. Leaned forward slightly. Commander, the galaxy has spent 8,000 years fearing this moment. Every species in the Conquered has prepared for the possibility of human awakening. We have built weapons, trained soldiers, developed strategies, but none of us truly know what humanity wants. So I am asking you directly, what do you want? It was a question Lisa had been asking herself since the moment she opened her eyes in the revival bay. What did humanity want? What could they possibly want after everything they had done, everything they had lost, everything they had become? She stood and walked to the viewport, looking out at the assembled human fleet. Each of those ships carried millions of her people, survivors of a war so terrible that they had chosen to erase themselves from history rather than risk fighting again. They had given up their homes, their families, their entire civilization. They had sacrificed everything for the chance to start over. Tell me about the galaxy, Lisa said finally. Tell me what happened while we slept. Told her. She spoke of 8,000 years of history, of empires that had risen and fallen, of wars that had been fought and won. She spoke of the Conquered and its mission to maintain peace, of the elder races and their ancient wisdom, of the younger species and their endless ambition. She spoke of the first law and the fear that had created it, the terror that humanity inspired even in species that had never seen a human face. And through it all, Lisa listened without interruption. When finished, the human commander remained at the viewport for a long moment, processing everything she had learned. So our legacy is fear, Lisa said at last. Your legacy is survival, countered. You fought the most terrible war in galactic history, and you survived. You looked into the abyss of extinction and you stepped back. That is not nothing, Commander. That is perhaps the most important thing any species has ever done. Lisa turned to face the ambassador. We did not step back. We ran away. We hid behind a barrier and went to sleep because we could not trust ourselves to stay awake. That is not strength, ambassador. That is weakness. Considered this carefully. Perhaps, she said, or perhaps it was the greatest act of courage your species ever performed. You recognized your own danger and chose to remove it from the universe. How many species can say the same? The two beings studied each other across the conference table, human and ancient, mortal and eternal. Between them lay 8,000 years of history and fear. Behind them lay the weight of decisions that would shape the future of the galaxy. I need to consult with my people, Lisa said finally, but I want you to know something, Ambassador. We did not ask to be awakened. We did not ask for this conflict with the... And we do not want another war. What do you want? Asked again. Lisa smiled, though there was no joy in the expression. We want a chance to prove that we can be better than we were. We want the opportunity to show the galaxy that humanity is more than just violence and destruction. Can your Concord give us that chance? Rose from her chair, her energy form shimmering with colors that had no names in any human language. I cannot speak for the entire Concord, she said, but I can tell you this. When I return to our capital, I will argue for that chance. I will tell them that the humans I met were not monsters. They were simply people trying to find their way in a universe that fears them. That is all we can ask. The two leaders parted ways and departed for the conquered capital with her report. Behind her, humanity began the long process of deciding its own future. And somewhere in the depths of space, the barrier that had protected them for 8 remained open, a door between two worlds that had been separated for far too long. The reckoning had begun. 6 months had passed since the awakening. 6 months of meetings and debates, of arguments and reconciliations, of humanity slowly coming to terms with what they had become. The sleeper vessels drifted in formation around the Endurance, their populations awake and active, their systems humming with energy that had been dormant for 8,000 years. Nearly 200 million humans now lived and breathed and wondered about their future. The Human Council had been assembled from the surviving leaders of the Exodus. Ship commanders, military officers, scientists, and diplomats gathered in a great chamber aboard the Endurance to make the decision that would shape their species forever. They had argued for months about what to do next. Some wanted to seal the barrier and return to sleep, waiting another 8,000 years for the galaxy to forget them again. Others wanted to claim their place among the stars by force, using their superior technology to carve out an empire that no one could challenge. But most of them, the quiet majority who had lived through the Great Burn and remembered its horrors, wanted something different. They wanted redemption. Commander Lisa Grant stood before the council and looked out at the faces of her people. She saw fear there, and hope, and determination. She saw the weight of 8,000 years of exile and the hunger for something more. These were the survivors of humanity's worst moment, the ones who had chosen to remove themselves from the universe rather than risk destroying it. And now they had to choose again. We have discussed this matter for months, Lisa said, her voice carrying through the silent chamber. We have considered every option, every possibility, every path forward. And now the time has come to make our decision. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The galaxy remembers us as monsters. They remember the Great Burn, the weapons we created, the systems we destroyed. For 8,000 years, our memory has been used to frighten young species into obedience. We are the darkness at the edge of their stories, the nightmare that keeps them awake at night. A murmur ran through the council. These were painful truths that none of them wanted to hear. But we are more than our worst moments, Lisa continued. We are more than the sum of our destruction. We are human beings, capable of great evil but also capable of great good. We can choose what we become. We can choose to be different. Captain Samuel Drake rose from his seat. The question is how, he said. How do we prove to a galaxy that fears us that we have changed? How do we earn the trust of species that have spent 8,000 years preparing for our return? Lisa nodded. We prove it through action. We join the Galactic Conquered not as conquerors but as partners. We offer our technology not as weapons but as tools. We show them, day by day and deed by deed, that humanity can be a force for good in this universe. The debate that followed was long and heated. Some council members argued that the galaxy would never accept them, that their reputation was too damaged to repair. Others worried that joining the conquered would mean surrendering their independence, becoming just another species in a federation of hundreds. And some, a small but vocal minority, insisted that humanity should take what they deserved by force. But in the end, the vote was not even close. By a margin of nearly 3-1, the Human Council voted to seek membership in the Galactic Conquered. They would emerge from their exile not as conquerors but as petitioners, asking for a chance to prove themselves to a universe that feared them. Lisa transmitted their decision to Ambassador, who had been waiting at the edge of human space for their response. The ancient being received the news with something that might have been relief, though her energy form made such emotions difficult to read. The conquered will deliberate, replied, but I believe they will accept your petition. There are many who still fear you, Commander, but there are also many who hope that humanity can become something new, something better. And what do you believe? Was quiet for a long moment. I believe that every species has the capacity for both destruction and creation. What defines them is which capacity they choose to develop. Your species has shown remarkable skill at destruction. Perhaps now you will show equal skill at building something worth preserving. The first human diplomatic vessel departed for the conquered capital 3 weeks later. It was a small ship, unarmed and unescorted, carrying a delegation of 6 humans who would represent their species before the Great Assembly of the Galaxy. Lisa Grant led the delegation personally, refusing to send others into danger that she was not willing to face herself. The journey took 2 months through the fold space lanes that connected the galaxy. Lisa spent the time studying the histories and cultures of the species they would encounter, trying to understand a universe that had moved on without humanity for 8,000 years. So much had changed. So much had stayed the same. And everywhere she looked, she found traces of the fear that humanity had inspired. The conquered capital was a ring world built around an ancient star, home to billions of beings from hundreds of species. Lisa had seen impressive things in her life, had commanded ships capable of cracking planets and led armies across solar systems. But nothing had prepared her for the sheer scale of what the galaxy had built in humanity's absence. The assembly chamber was the size of a small moon, filled with delegates from every corner of known space. They watched in silence as the human delegation entered, their eyes fixed on the small beings who had inspired such terror for so long. Lisa felt their gaze like a physical weight, the accumulated fear and hatred of 8,000 years pressing down on her shoulders. She stood before the assembly and spoke the words she had rehearsed 1,000 times. She acknowledged humanity's crimes, accepted responsibility for the destruction they had caused, expressed remorse for the lives they had taken. She did not make excuses or offer justifications. She simply told the truth about what her species had done and what they hoped to become. When she finished, the chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then Ambassador Al rose from his seat, ancient and wise and tired beyond measure. He had been there when the first law was created. He had argued for humanity's isolation when others wanted their extermination, and now he would speak for or against their return. I have watched species rise and fall across this galaxy, Al said, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. I have seen the young grow into wisdom and the old fade into dust. I have witnessed acts of courage and cowardice, of destruction and creation, of despair and hope. And in all my long years, I have never seen a species do what humanity did at the end of their war." He paused, letting his words sink in. They chose exile. They chose to remove themselves from the universe rather than risk causing more harm. They gave up their homes, their histories, their place among the stars. They sacrificed everything for the possibility that they might one day return as better beings. Al turned to face Lisa directly. "I do not know if humanity has changed. I do not know if they can be trusted. But I believe they deserve the chance to prove themselves. I vote to accept their petition." The voting took 3 days. Species that had feared humanity had to decide whether to welcome them into the community of the galaxy or continue their isolation forever. Arguments raged through the chamber and the corridors beyond, delegates pleading and threatening and bargaining for votes. In the end, humanity was accepted by a margin so narrow that it might have gone either way on a different day. But the margin did not matter. What mattered was that the door was open, that humanity had been given a chance to prove themselves, that the long exile was finally over. Lisa stood on the observation deck of her ship as it departed the conquered capital, watching the ring world shrink behind them. Samuel Drake joined her at the viewport, his face thoughtful in the starlight. "Think they will ever really trust us?" he asked. "Not completely," Lisa admitted. "And maybe they should not. We did terrible things, Sam. We nearly destroyed ourselves and took 3 star systems with us. That is not something that gets forgotten." "So what do we do?" Lisa smiled, the first genuine smile she had allowed herself since waking from the long sleep. "We prove them wrong. One day at a time, one good deed at a time. We show them that humanity is more than the sum of our worst moments. We show them that we learned from the great burn. And if we did not learn, if we are still the same violent species we were 8,000 years ago, then we learn now." Lisa turned to face her old friend. "We do not have to be what we were. That is the whole point of waking up to a new day. You get another chance to be better." The ship entered the Fold space lane, carrying news of humanity's acceptance back to the waiting fleet. Behind them, the barrier that had protected humanity for 8 continued to dissolve, atom by atom, revealing the stars beyond. The universe had one rule: do not wake the humanity. The galaxy had violated it. But perhaps in the end, that violation would prove to be the best thing that ever happened to either of them. The humans were awake now, and this time they intended to do better. The sleeper vessels began their slow dispersal across the galaxy, carrying humanity back to the stars they had abandoned so long ago. Some would settle on new worlds, building colonies where their children could grow up without the shadow of the Great Burn. Others would join the Conquered's peacekeeping forces, using their terrible skills to protect rather than destroy. And a few would return to Earth itself, to see what had become of there after 8,000 years of silence. Lisa Grant watched it all happen, guiding her people through the difficult transition from exiles to citizens of the galaxy. There were setbacks and failures, moments when the old violence threatened to resurface, when the fear in alien eyes reminded humanity of what they had been. But there were also triumphs and breakthroughs, moments of connection and understanding that proved change was possible. The universe had feared humanity for 8,000 years. Now it would learn to know them, and perhaps, in time, it would learn to trust them as well. The new dawn had begun.